strength, O Zion. Put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. Shake off the dust and arise.
We're in week 5, hard to believe, right, of the early believers in the Messiah. And we're still looking at the very early Jewish believers who called themselves the Way. And we determined last week that they called themselves the Way because their rabbi, the Messiah Yeshua, had taught them a new halakha, a new way of walking out the commands of God. And they did that by the Spirit of God. In review, just a couple of things that we looked at. The Pharisees' halakha prohibited Jews from going into the home of non-Jews, even if those non-Jews were devout. It wasn't until they completely converted that they were allowed to go in and eat with those who were not Jewish by birth. This was not true of the halakha of Yeshua and the spirit that was followed by the believers. The Pharisees' halakha considered non-Jews unclean, but the halakha of Yeshua and the disciples did not. The Pharisees' halakha required that non-Jews in the diaspora be circumcised to be part of the covenant community. Not so the halakha of Yeshua and the believers. You see, what most of Paul's letters are about is really defining what the halakha of the communities of the followers of Yeshua, what these communities were going to look like. Remember, Jewish communities that these believers came out of were distinctive in the way that they walked out the Torah of God. You know, anybody can get a copy of the Torah and follow its instructions. But what makes a community truly distinctive is the way that they're walked out. As an example, the communities of Jewish believers outside the land of Israel lived somewhat differently than the communities inside the land of Israel. This was not because they had a different written law of Moses. It was because they had different way of living out those commands, a different halakha. Remember, that word means to walk. We looked at in the early weeks the differences on divorce, say between the school of Hillel, a sage from outside the land of Israel, and Shammai, a sage from within the land. Both kept the command, they just didn't agree on how to keep it. Well, Yeshua lays out his halakha in the Sermon on the Mount. And anyone who's familiar with the rabbinic halakha of the day and has read the Sermon on the Mount is going to tell you that Yeshua's way of walking out the commands is much more difficult because it's walked out from the heart. His instructions to the rich young man, for example, to sell all you have and come and follow me, were much more stringent than the halakha of the day of the Pharisees. No rabbi of the day would advocate to you, sell all you have and come follow me. But that's exactly what Yeshua required. So yes, it's hard, but then later Yeshua tells his disciples how to receive the power of the Holy Spirit to live out those difficult instructions, that difficult way of living out the commands. He tells his disciples, you wait until you receive power from on high. And it was recorded for us in Acts chapter 2 that they did exactly that. Yeshua advocated a life that lived out the Torah through the leading of the Spirit of God. The ultimate living out of the commands of God, the ultimate interpretation of the commands of God came from the author of those commands, the Spirit of God. So Yeshua's Sermon on the Mount and later teachings, along with the letters of Paul and the other apostles, tell us what the communities of believers are going to look like, how they're going to live their lives, how that's going to be different. How do they live and walk out the commands of God? And what makes them distinctive? What makes them distinctive from, say, the Pharisees, school of Hillel or school of Shammai? It's the way that they lived out the commands. And we also saw that they called themselves Nazarenes because they were followers, disciples of Yeshua of Nazareth. They were followers and disciples. They were true disciples. They had memorized his teachings and also walked out those teachings. No matter how hard they were, they lived out those teachings. These men and women were disciples in the truest sense of the word. The fact is that the term Talmudim in Hebrew or disciple in English, that's how they viewed themselves. It's the term most often used to describe the early believers in our New Covenant scriptures. And it was the reason that I spent so much time on that disciple-rabbi relationship, because you have to understand that. Often when we think of disciples, we think of just 12 men. But listen, Acts chapter 6 and verse 1 and 2. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Grecian Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples. So here we're told that the 12 gathered all the disciples. You see, we see that term disciple as just those 12, but it was a term for the believers. They considered themselves to be disciples. Those who were learning to walk in the way that Yeshua walked through life. He was their rabbi. Listen to what is said in Acts chapter 9, verse 10 and 11. In Damascus there was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord called to him in a vision, Ananias. Yes, Lord, he said. The Lord told him, go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. For he is praying, and in a vision he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight. And so here we have Ananias in Damascus. He's the one who's going to lay hands on Shaul to restore his sight. And what is he termed? A disciple. He lives in Damascus, so we find disciples of Yeshua in the diaspora. That means they too were learning his teachings word for word. They too were walking through life as he walked through life. You know, when we read that term disciple, it should now bring to mind that it was one who knows and teaches the words of the master, who learns the words of the master word for word, and can recount them through the Spirit of God, as we see here. Let's look at another use of this term disciple in Acts chapter 11, verse 27. And in these days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch, and there stood up of them one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be a great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. The disciples, each according to his ability, decided to provide help for the brothers living in Judea. They did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. And so we find the believers in Antioch were called disciples. And not only that, we see them doing the same thing as the early disciples, giving to have things equal even with those who lived in Jerusalem. They're sending money to Jerusalem, sharing with those who are fellow disciples, even though they live away. Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 5 say, and he came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was a Jewess and a believer, and whose father was a Greek. Timothy is termed a disciple, so we have disciples in Lystra. Acts chapter 21, verse 15 says, after this, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Mnason, where we were to stay. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples. So we have disciples in Cyprus. Now, Timothy was a disciple, and he didn't even know Yeshua, and yet he's called a disciple. And they don't call them disciples for nothing. They knew what the term meant. We don't really realize what it means, but now we do. They knew what that term meant, and if you weren't a disciple, they weren't about to call you a disciple. These were men who were learning to walk as Yeshua walked, teach as Yeshua taught, learn the words of the Master. They knew what that word meant. And they were out in the world. These disciples were fulfilling the task Yeshua had given them to do, go make other disciples. Disciples of who? Disciples of Yeshua, teaching them to obey all that he commanded, just as Matthew says. Acts chapter 18, verse 24. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Yeshua accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained the way of God more adequately. When Apollos went to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. And on arriving, he was a great help to those who, by grace, had believed. He vigorously refuted Jews in public debate, proving from scriptures that Yeshua was the Messiah. The point is, there was more to being part of the way than just believing that Yeshua was the Messiah. You were to be a disciple. And being a disciple meant that you learned the teachings of Messiah. And I don't want to be redundant because it's this important, word for word. And you had the leading of the Spirit of God. And when we start to combine these things, we start to get a far different picture of the early congregations than what has been presented to us in the church. In the church, we get a rather distorted view of these disciples through the lens of the letters written by Paul, Shaul of Tarsus. Something we've forgotten in the church is that those letters that we're reading were exactly that, letters to someone else. They were written in response to specific problems. We in the church read those letters after they're far removed from their context, far removed from the problem they were addressing. And we come up with some disastrous results. You see, without the proper context, you can't understand the writings of Paul. And so what happens is there's a huge difference between the Shaul that we read about in the book of Acts and how he lives and the Shaul that we read about in his letters, because we've removed those letters from their context. But we get the true picture of Paul and how he lived in the book of Acts, as recorded by Luke. The book of Acts portrays a Hebrew of Hebrews who has found his Messiah and become a disciple. Acts portrays, as we're going to see in a moment, that Shaul was a Torah-observant Jew who preaches and worships in the synagogues, keeps the festivals, and makes Nazirite vows. But his letters, once removed from their context, portray a man who's teaching and preaching something far removed from what Yeshua taught, and could hardly be deemed a disciple of Yeshua. He, through the lens of those letters, removed from their context, would appear as a man beginning a new religion. Which brings us to this week's teaching. Because no study of these early believers or those who follow them would be complete without a look at Paul. And we're going to look at him briefly today. Now, as I said, there's one thing that most who really study the book of Acts, if you really study the book of Acts, and then you read Paul's epistles, you're going to come away with a discrepancy between the two. You're going to come away with a discrepancy between the way Shaul of Tarsus is portrayed in the book of Acts and the way he walks through life and the letters that he wrote, particularly if you read the ones to Galatia and Rome. In his letters, he appears as one who advocates abandoning the law of God. And yet in the book of Acts, as Scarson, as we're going to see in a minute, found, we have a Shaul that's continuing in the synagogue. We have a Shaul that circumcises Timothy, who's half Greek and half Jew. We have a Paul who's making Nazirite vows, going to the temple to offer animals, participating in the festivals of the Lord, and describing himself as a Pharisee, a Hebrew of Hebrews. And so to the casual reader and the studier alike, what we have, what would seem to be a Shaul with a dual personality. Perhaps he's suffering from some mental illness, because there's two different Shauls portrayed here. Scarson and Havlik, in their book, The Jewish Believers in Jesus, the early centuries, they devote several chapters to this dilemma without coming to any real resolve. and let's just read their conclusion after they've gone through a bunch of these things. They say this: the Paul of Acts is without exception a law-abiding Jew. This is apparent above in all the apologetic speeches in Acts 22 through 26. As demonstrated above, it's also clear in Acts chapter 21, verse 24, where it is said explicitly that Paul should undergo a cleansing in order to show himself observes and guards the law. In these cases, Paul's piety is essential for the flow of the narrative, and the editorial hand is rather obvious. Here, the author stresses Paul's Jewishness. Another possible evidence of Lucan tendency to depict Paul as a pious Jew is the circumcision of Timothy. And so in their conclusion, they come up with the same thing that anyone who's going to read the unbiased account of Paul's life through the eyes of Luke is going to say that Paul was a Torah-observant Jew. They go on in their conclusion to address the typical Christian thought. In part of their conclusion, it's entitled The Real Paul, The Real Paul. And they will first quote a scholar named Henshin, and he comes to the typical conclusion that the church or Christians usually come to. Listen to what he says. The Real Paul. Discussing the episode concerning circumcision of Timothy, Henshin rejects Luke's account with reference to the real Paul, the picture of Paul that can be deduced from his undisputed letters. This is typical thought. Look at the letters, and we look at them and read them out of context and ignore the history in Acts, and we come up with a different Paul. Listen to what Scarson says in refute to that last idea. As we have seen above, this approach to the quest of the historical Paul is too simplistic. The Pauline Paul cannot be claimed to be more real than the Lucan Paul. This is evident especially with regard to the letter to the Galatians, a letter that is often used to check the presentation of Paul in Acts. The highly polemic character of Galatians should prevent us from using that letter as representative expression of Paul's views. Needless to say, Paul's letters are fundamental for the understanding of Paul, but they do not give us an unbiased presentation of the historical Paul. Paul had specific purposes when writing his letters, but none of them include a wish to give a complete picture of himself and his theology. Now notice what he says about the book of Galatians, that it is polemic. And just so that we understand what Scarson is saying here, let's look at the definition of the word polemic. It says, an aggressive attack on a refutation of the opinions or principles of another. Okay, so let me ask you this. In the book of Galatians, who is Paul's aggressive attack against? Is it against God's Torah? Heaven forbid. Of course not. It's against those who advocate the circumcision of Gentiles, requiring them to obey Jewish law. Not God's law, because you can't find circumcision of Gentiles in God's law. You find it in Jewish law. And what they're saying is what I said earlier. You cannot take that letter that was written for a specific purpose out of its context and draw conclusions about the man Shaul. And neither would it be wise to try and base what he's ultimately teaching by a letter that's addressing a specific problem without keeping that problem continually in focus as you read the letter. Let's look at Luke's history of Paul. You know, Luke devotes 17 chapters to the life and ministry of Shaul. And we get, with the exception of Yeshua, more recorded about the life of this man than any of the other believers in Yeshua. I'm going to momentarily skip over chapter 9 where Paul meets Yeshua and begins his journey to become a follower of the way, and focus on life after he becomes a follower of the way. Let's look at how Shaul describes himself. And we've looked at these things before at KSS, but we need to be make sure that everyone who listens to this study from this day forward, on television or radio or whatever, is firmly rooted in this as well. And we need to be firmly rooted in it because next week we're going to move about 50 years or so beyond the first century. We're going to go to the destruction of the temple and then beyond, and things are going to start to change. But let's start the day with Paul describing himself, and then we're going to look at Luke, how he records his life and the ministry of Shaul. First, how Shaul describes himself. Philippians 3:4. If anyone thinks he has reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal, persecuting the church, as for legalistic righteousness, faultless. And so Paul is clear about who he is. He's a Hebrew born of the people of Israel. And notice what he says about the law, that he identified himself with the Pharisees. Elsewhere, we're going to read that he was thoroughly trained in the traditions of the fathers by Gamaliel. Let's read Luke's Paul in Acts chapter 22. See if we can get a greater understanding of this person and how he describes himself. This is Luke recording Paul describing himself. Then Paul said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, and brought up in this city. Under Gamaliel, I was thoroughly trained in the law of the fathers, and was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as also the high priest and the council can testify. I even obtained letters from them to their brothers in Damascus, and went to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. And so here again, he tells us that he was a Pharisee, that he studied under Gamaliel. And what did he study? Listen, you got to read these letters carefully. You got to read these things carefully. Thoroughly trained in the law of the fathers. What is the law of the fathers? Well, we all know now. But most read this and think this refers to the law given at Sinai, the Torah of God. That's not true. The fathers referred to here are the fathers referred to in the Mishneh, Tractate Pirkei Avot, or in English, the sayings of the fathers. It's also the fathers who followed them, like Hillel and Shammai. You see, he's thoroughly trained in the Pharisaic traditions revolving around keeping the law of God. In keeping and defending those traditions of the fathers, he tells us he persecuted the followers of the way. And we know what the way is now. It's the Torah lived out according to the Spirit, the halakha of Yeshua. Shaul is trained in the best school of Judaism, as Gamaliel is actually the grandson of Hillel, a Pharisee and one of the fathers of rabbinic Judaism. And there's probably no finer school to have been taught in than in this school of Gamaliel. He was a follower of the halakha of the Pharisees, particularly the school of Hillel. He knew the traditions of the fathers according to Hillel. And now with that, let's get back to his change, because Paul tells us what finding Yeshua did to him in Philippians 3:7. But whatever I was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Messiah. What is more, I consider everything lost compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Messiah Yeshua my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Messiah and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Messiah. The righteousness that comes from God is by faith. And I want to know the Messiah in the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings and becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attain to the resurrection of the dead. And that he did. Paul tells us that he counts all of those things, that finest school of Judaism, rubbish. Compared all the traditions of the fathers, rubbish, compared to knowing Messiah. And notice, it doesn't say knowing of Messiah, knowing about Messiah. It says knowing Messiah, because Messiah was in his life daily directing him. because that's the way we're to live out Torah. The things that he knew and that he taught and was taught, the traditions of the fathers, were rubbish compared to the halakha of the Messiah Yeshua. He now has a righteousness like Abraham that comes not through keeping the Torah through traditions of the fathers, because he didn't have any fathers, traditions to follow, but one that comes through faith. He has a walk that comes through relationship with God like Abraham. Abraham kept God's laws through relationship with him. That, my friends, is why he uses Abraham and not Gamliel as an example to the Romans. The fact is, he never, in all of his ministry, in never one of his letters, mentions his former teacher, Gamliel. Only Luke mentions him when he tells us that's where he studied. This is the Shaul as he presented himself. This is the same Shaul as Luke presented him, a Torah-observant Jew who walked out the Torah in the way of the Messiah because he was a follower of the way. What Paul is not is the distorted view of him that we come away with from his letters in the Galatians because we've taken them out of context. Because the problem in Galatia, again, were Pharisees who were telling the God-fearers that they had to be circumcised and made to keep the law as the fathers of Judaism had instructed. The very thing that Paul calls rubbish.